Apple just disabled a security feature for an entire country. Not because it was broken and not because of a bug, but because the UK government demanded a backdoor into encrypted user data, and Apple refused to build one. So instead of compromising their encryption for everyone, Apple just turned off the feature for UK users entirely. It was their call, their choice. Rather than building a backdoor, they pulled the product. And this isn't some authoritarian regime we're talking about. This is a Western democracy, one of the Five Eyes. But they're not alone in this. The EU has a roadmap to develop what they call lawful access capabilities by 2030. And the FBI has been lobbying Congress for years to mandate backdoors. And all of it is happening under the same justification: protecting children and fighting terrorism, which we can all get behind. We all agree that those two things need to be addressed. But here's the problem. There's no such thing as a backdoor that only works for the good guys. But let's talk about this specific case. See, back in 2022, Apple rolled out a feature called Advanced Data Protection. It was optional. Most people never even turned it on. But if you did, it gave you true end-to-end encryption for your iCloud backups, your photos, and your notes. This feature made it so that even Apple couldn't see your stuff. They don't hold the keys, you do. For everyone who didn't enable it, Apple uses what they call standard data protection. Your data is still encrypted, but Apple holds the keys. If law enforcement shows up with a warrant, Apple can decrypt your stuff and hand it over. That's how they've cooperated with thousands of investigations over the years. But advanced data protection changed that equation. If you turned it on, Apple couldn't help even if they wanted to. Only about 10% of users ever even enabled it. Most people didn't even know about it, or they didn't want to risk losing access to the data if they forgot their password. You see, that's the trade-off. With real end-to-end encryption, if you lose your keys, you lose your data forever. But that 10% that opted into the feature was enough to make governments nervous. The UK government issued a secret order under something called the Investigatory Powers Act. They demanded that Apple provide what they called blanket capability to access encrypted iCloud data. Not for specific accounts and not for specific investigations, but for any Apple user, anywhere in the world. So that meant the UK wanted the ability to access encrypted data belonging to American citizens, German citizens, Japanese citizens, anyone who uses an iPhone. And Apple refused. They said they've never built a backdoor or a master key into any of their products, and they never will. So in February of 2025, they just turned off the advanced data protection feature for all UK users. Their argument was there's no way to build a backdoor that only works for British authorities. Any vulnerability that they create would be a target for foreign intelligence services, organized crime, sophisticated hackers. Once it exists, it can be found. And when it is, everyone using that system becomes less secure. The standoff between country and company lasted for months. But then the US government got involved. President Trump, Vice President Vance, and Tulsi Gabbard at the DNI all made statements. They applied pressure to the argument. They said that the UK's demands threatened American citizens' privacy. In August 2025, the United Kingdom backed down and they withdrew their order. Now let's talk about encryption and how this order would even be applied if Apple agreed. AES 256 encryption is the standard used by everything from your banking app to your messaging platform. It's mathematically unbreakable. To crack it through brute force would take longer than the age of the universe, even with every computer in the world working together. So when the government talks about lawful access, they're not proposing to break the math. They can't. What they are proposing is to compromise how that math is implemented. There's basically four approaches. There's key escrow, where your encryption keys are stored with a trusted third party who would be able to hand them over if given a warrant. This is most likely what Apple would have done. But there's also client-side scanning, where your messages are analyzed before they're encrypted or after they've been decrypted right on your device. And then there's weakened key generation, where the random numbers used to create encryption keys are made predictable. And finally, there's implementation backdoors, where vulnerabilities are deliberately built into the software. And none of these are theoretical. They've all been done before. Researchers found in 2023 that Tetra radios, the encrypted system used by police and military across Europe, had an encryption that was deliberately weakened. It claimed to use 128-bit keys, but automatically compressed them down to 56 bits before encrypting, which made it way easier to crack. And then there was a situation with Skype. They advertised that they had end-to-end encryption for years. It turned out they had a backdoor that let them hand over decrypted messages to the NSA. And of course, there's the NSA's dual EC DRBG backdoor. They paid RSA Security $10 million to use a compromised random number generator as the default in all of their products. When that information came out, it was a scandal, but it shows exactly what happens when you trust governments to build special access into cryptographic systems. Right now, the EU is pushing hard for this. Their argument is that 85% of criminal investigations rely on digital evidence, and terrorists use WhatsApp. Drug traffickers coordinate on Telegram. Child predators share material on encrypted platforms. Law enforcement can't see any of it, even with a warrant. There's a Protect EU strategy, and it was unveiled in 2025. It lays out a plan to change that. They're not proposing to ban encryption outright. I believe they're smarter than that. But instead, they want to develop what they call lawful access to encrypted data while safeguarding cybersecurity and fundamental rights. By 2026, they'll have a technology roadmap. And by 2030, their plan is for Europol to have the capability to decrypt private communications. Germany has pushed back on this. Their justice minister called mass scanning of private messages taboo in a constitutional state. Signal CEO warned that they'd pull out of Europe entirely rather than comply with backdoor mandates. The Netherlands, Sweden, all the privacy advocates across the continent have raised alarms. But the pressure keeps building. The EU is also planning to expand data retention requirements. This would force service providers to keep your communications metadata longer so that law enforcement can access it even after you think it's been deleted. Over here in the US, the FBI has maintained the same stance for years, that end-to-end encryption creates lawless digital spaces. They've drafted multiple versions of the Lawful Access to Encrypted Data Act through Congress. None have passed yet, but they keep trying. Let's look at the Salt Typhoon hack. It was a massive operation. And in response, the CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, they issued guidance recommending that government officials and high-value targets use only end-to-end encrypted communications. It's pretty ironic that the same government agencies demanding backdoors for investigations are simultaneously telling their own people to use unbreakable encryption to protect against sophisticated adversaries. So if you use an iPhone, understand this. Your iCloud backup is accessible to Apple, and therefore to law enforcement with a warrant, unless you specifically enable advanced data protection. Your photos, your notes, your messages, if they're backed up to iCloud, they're not as private as you might think. If you're in the UK, you don't even have that option. The government's demand costs British users access to Apple's strongest privacy protection. Russia, India, Brazil, multiple countries have laws that could be used to demand backdoor access. If one major democracy succeeds in forcing a backdoor, others most likely will follow. Over 500 cryptography scientists and researchers signed an open letter opposing the EU's chat control proposal. They called it smoke and mirrors. The Internet Architecture Board and human rights organizations and security experts all around the world have all said the same thing. You cannot weaken encryption for some without making it weak for everyone. All right, guys, that's all I got. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review. I really appreciate all the feedback that I receive. If you have any friends and family that enjoy security and privacy content, Send them the show. Send them this episode and tell them don't get got.